The date is 1943, and just a little under a year ago, the United States was rocked by a surprise attack against its most important naval base in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. Many ships were destroyed, more were seriously damaged, and while the Japanese failed in their objective to destroy the U.S. Pacific Carrier Fleet, they did succeed in knocking the U.S. Navy out of the fight for the foreseeable future. Unable to muster a surface fleet large enough to challenge the Japanese Navy, the United States has instead dispatched the one part of its Pacific Fleet completely unaffected by the surprise attack, the American Silent Service, a submarine fleet made up of dozens of silent killers. For months, they've enacted their own revenge on the Japanese, slipping past their pickets of destroyers and corvettes to strike at the vulnerable merchant shipping fleet that all too often travels unaccompanied by armed escorts. The U.S. has sunk tens of thousands of tons of shipping in the first 6 months of the war, and the undersea campaign has only just begun. Aboard the USS Seawolf, Captain Fredrick Warden keeps his eyes glued to the submarine's periscope. This is his 7th patrol since the war started, and technically will be his last as a submarine commander. After this final patrol, he'll return back to a U.S. naval station somewhere and be placed in command of a portion of the U.S.'s submarine fleet in the Pacific, giving orders from a safe office somewhere rather than the bridge of a sub deep in enemy territory. Warden could have finished his patrol quietly, having finished his assigned patrol route and on his way back home. However, he had several torpedoes in his hold, and going back home with live fish didn't sit right with any submarine commander in the U.S. Navy. On a hunch, he decided to investigate a deep-water anchorage on a small island near the Philippines, hoping to run into stray Japanese ships and expend his remaining torpedoes before sailing for home. What he finds is the opportunity of a lifetime. Sitting at anchor are 4 Japanese cruisers lined up side by side next to each other. The Japanese have built a small naval station here, which will be good intel to share with the command later. And along with the cruisers are several merchant marine ships. By now, he's sunk many merchant marine ships, ensuring that the vital flow of fuel, ammunition, and food would fail to reach stranded Japanese troops across the Pacific. The cruisers are the real target here, and with 4 of them lined up in a row, he knows he'll never have an opportunity like this again. A fitting end to his final patrol. Submarines rarely ever attack Japanese combat ships as the risks are simply too great. Destroyers, cruisers, and especially corvettes simply have too shallow a draft, and torpedoes need to be aimed perfectly or will more often than not miss their target and detonate too far away to do any damage. That's if the damn things even worked right in the first place. On his first combat patrol just a single day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Warden and his USS Seawolf took on a load of torpedoes from a Philippine base. The day after that, he fired on a Japanese vessel, getting 2 direct hits, which did absolutely nothing. Both torpedoes failed to detonate, and one managed to get itself lodged in the ship instead. The third torpedo he was grateful hadn't detonated, as it had suffered a malfunction common to early American torpedoes and swam back around to its launch point, making a big circle. If he hadn't given the order to dive, the torpedo would have rammed his hull as well. Though with the luck he was having, this one probably would have actually detonated. The torpedo problems were hardly unique to Warden. The American Mark 14 torpedo had one of the best propulsion systems in the world at the time, but suffered from a great many other defects that made it all but useless in battle. 2 of the biggest problems was its electromagnetic detector, which was designed to sense the magnetic hull of a ship and explode when the torpedo arrived at its closest point to the hull. In order to do this, the detector would track a series of electronic signals that would fire more and more rapidly the closer the torpedo came to the hull, and then slow down as it traveled away from the enemy ship's hull. That way, as soon as the signals began to slow rather than increase, the detector would order the warhead to explode. Unfortunately, while this had worked perfectly in testing on the Great Lakes, anomalies around the equator and in the Pacific severely compromised the detector. The second major problem with the Mark 14 torpedo was its depth gauge, which would incorrectly read water pressure to tell the torpedo it was traveling at a depth greater than it really was. This caused the torpedo to dive by as much as 20 feet, completely missing its intended target. While problems plagued the torpedo, Naval Command was reluctant to accept something was wrong with the weapon. To help pressure a decision to overhaul the weapon, early in the war, Warden had held his sub's position even while under enemy fire, in order to record the effects of 2 of his dud torpedoes on an enemy ship. The footage nearly cost him his life, but it would help ensure that many more American submariners wouldn't be going into combat with duds in their hold. Today, though, Warden is not carrying duds. His fish are live and primed and combat tested, Any submariner would still prefer to avoid attacking enemy combat vessels who can fire back, as they're difficult targets to hit versus slow, broad-keeled merchant ships. But even just a year into the war, Japanese merchant ships are already becoming rare. The American submarine campaign against Japanese shipping has been devastatingly effective. The ships before him, though, are at anchor, and to his surprise, there's not a single vessel on patrol looking out for American subs. Warder decides to take the opportunity, knowing he would be poking the hornet's nest, and that any one of those ships or the many Japanese destroyers nearby could blow him out of the water with a single depth charge. Warder lines up his attack against one of the cruisers and fires off 2 torpedoes. The fish runs straight and true, and through the periscope, Warder watches the line of bubbles speeding directly at the enemy ship. Moments later, there are 2 explosions on the ship's stern, 2 direct hits. The crew give an excited shout, and then quickly quiet back down as the ship immediately dives. Above the waves, the Japanese ships are coming to life, and already small patrol boats are looking for the intruding American sub. As the Seawolf slowly sneaks out of the small cove, ships above begin to drop depth charges. Warder orders the boat forward at low power. He doesn't want to risk accelerating and giving his position away to any sonar operators aboard the Japanese ships. This does mean that he's exposed to the deadly rain of depth charges for longer though, and a few near misses shake the sub. Eventually though, he manages to escape to open ocean and safety. Warder carefully considers his next move. He still has a hold that's half full of torpedoes, and incredibly the Japanese have still not dispersed their fleet. The 3 surviving cruisers remain, and after an initial flurry of activity, other Japanese destroyers seem to have resumed their normal patrols. The ships inside the cove are still incredibly vulnerable, probably figuring that no American submarine commander would be insane enough to risk his life a second time. For Warder, there's no option. He orders the men to rest. Tomorrow before dawn, they will return and strike once more. There are now more Japanese ships on the lookout for subs, but the defensive screen is still surprisingly light and easy to penetrate. Silently, the Seawolf slips into a comfortable range of under 1,000 yards, takes her time to line up her shot, and fires 2 more torpedoes. Another Japanese cruiser is struck, and this one too will sink. Warder orders the Seawolf to dive once more, and once more the Japanese fleet begins to saturate the area with depth charges. There's more ships this time, and more depth charges, but for a second time the Seawolf manages to avoid being destroyed and makes for the safety of the open ocean. 2 days and 2 Japanese combat ships destroyed. In just this short campaign, Warder is already more successful than submarine captains over the course of multiple patrols. Sinking merchant ships is one thing after all, but sinking full-sized combat ships is another entirely, especially those armed with depth charges. He has 2 torpedoes left now, and Warder agonizes over his next choice. Does he press his luck, attempt another attack, or does he simply go home with 2 live fish in his hold? The opportunity to sink another Japanese combat ship weighs heavily on his mind, but so does the look on his men's faces. Most of them have accompanied him on all 7 patrols through the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. They've sunk many ships together, and they've cheated death on more occasions than he'd care to remember. Just like this is his last patrol, it will also be the final patrol for many of his men. Warder can't let the Japanese go though, not after what they did at Pearl Harbor. He decides to return and resume the hunt, determined to expend his last 2 torpedoes. The Japanese patrols are heavy on the 3rd day, having learned their lesson. Warder attempts to maneuver the Seawolf into the cove, but has to abort numerous times. The water's practically boiling with Japanese ships zipping back and forth, every one of them looking for Warder and his sub, and eager for revenge. Warder decides to back off and put out to sea once more. Now on the 3rd day of his campaign, he has to decide if he's going to try again tomorrow or let this go. His men are veterans, stalwart men of courage, the only type of man fit for a life beneath the waves, where any mistake could cost you your life. But he sees the fear etched on each man's face. He can see the exhaustion. The men are nearing their breaking point. They want to go home, but they believe in their captain. Warder decides to press the attack once more. The Japanese patrols have slacked only slightly, but this lapse is enough to give Warder the opening he needs. He maneuvers the Seawolf into the cove once more. Surely, no Japanese sailor would ever believe that an American would be crazy enough to attempt a 3rd attack. What Warder does next, though, is insane even by his own standards. There, slowly steaming along, is a large Japanese cruiser, and from its mast is flying the pendant of a Japanese squadron commander. the flagship of this detachment. Warder has his target. He spends 30 minutes slowly maneuvering into position, narrowly avoiding detection by the swarm of ships above. Every Japanese sailor in 100 miles has their eyes peeled and ears glued to a sonar, it seems. Warder risks raising the periscope, hoping that as it breaks over the wave, some sharp-eyed sailor won't spot it. He lifts it only long enough to confirm the target, and then gives the order to fire. 2 fish scream through the water, closing range to the Japanese squadron commander's flagship. In less than half a minute, twin detonations rock the big ship. Secondary explosions from stored munitions further adding to the chaos and destruction. Warder, however, is already deep beneath the waves, putting as much distance between himself and the Japanese as possible. The Japanese fleet is furious, and a dozen destroyers and cruisers scour the ocean for the Seawolf. They drop seemingly endless barrages of depth charges, and the Seawolf is subjected to an incredible 9-hour depth charge barrage, the longest of any American submarine, perhaps the longest of any submarine ever. Many of the hits are close enough to rock the small sub, some are close enough to rattle the teeth inside Warder's skull. The men hold, though Warder knows that he's driven them very close to the breaking point. The mission is over, and in his final patrol, Warder has scored his greatest victories. Warder's men would go on to give him the nickname of Fearless Freddy for his stunt in that small cove in the Pacific, a name that he would distinctly dislike. As he would explain in later interviews after the war, he was never fearless. He was just as afraid as any one of his sailors, and implying he was fearless, he felt took away from the courage of the men he served with. That attitude would perhaps best exemplify the character of Rear Admiral Fredrick Warden, though. A man brave in combat but humble in victory. Not only did he care deeply for the men under his command, but would often show compassion even to the Japanese whose ships he sunk, ordering his sub to surface and offering to take in the stranded sailors. Thanks to a loyal fanaticism to the Emperor and the shame of defeat, not a single Japanese sailor took him up on that offer, and so instead Warder ordered his men to toss the stranded sailors supplies and life jackets. To Admiral Warder, all men were ultimately brothers, even if they happened to be on opposite sides of the battlefield. If you liked this video, then click on this other great video right now, or this other amazing video from the Infographics show that we know you're going to love. Let's be honest, you're gonna love them both, but you have to click on one right now.